What's up, y'all? It's Grizzly Sugar. Welcome to my channel. A third video. See how it goes. So I think what I'm going to talk about is this whole thing of comicsgate. Now, growing up in the 80s and 90s, I was big into comic books. Not to the point, I collected them for a little while, but I was more interested in just the story. And I like to draw. I still love drawing. My art is, I guess, that artistic expression that I enjoy. And I'm not a young man. In fact, I'm a bit older, but I say that because I wanted to let you know that I still draw, and what I draw are superheroes. Star Wars and then some other stuff, my own personal ideas and stories. But the reason I do it is because it's a creative outlet. And it reminds me of the importance of thinking outside the box and, letting your mind wander into fantasy and enjoying that stuff. I've found getting older, becoming more responsible, that kind of, that way of thinking about the world starts to kind of go away, and I don't want that to happen. So I draw. Back when I was in high school, I went and created my own Marvel universe, did a lot of character redesigns, changed their stories around a little bit. I made up my own. And over the last, 20 years, I've just been adding to it. The designs change, the story changes. It's I got a lot of sketchbooks, and I look at those sketchbooks and I see the story that I've got in my head, and I realize how much it's changed over the years. And it's just a reminder, to think about those alternate realities, those different worlds, and I love it, and it's an escape. So this whole thing about comicsgate and comic books in general is, and I didn't really notice this, I didn't realize it, I just found myself not really wanting to buy comics, not being interested, at least in the Marvel stuff. I still pick up The Walking Dead. I like the comic stories. I think they do a pretty good job with it. I watched I used to watch the TV series, but this last season, it wasn't doing it for me. I love Fear the Walking Dead. Fear the Walking Dead has kind of grown on me, and I like what they've done with that story and the characters. But anyway, the comic book, The Walking Dead, I'm still really into. And that was really the only one that I would end up getting. A lot of stuff I just didn't bother with. Huge Wolverine fan. He's my favorite character. And he just, I didn't like the direction they were going with him. They were making him too powerful, making him, pretty much immortal. And, I didn't find myself able to relate to the character as much as I used to be able to. So I kind of fell away from it. And then, Marvel changed. They had this Marvel Now thing coming. They were doing things a bit differently. They had a female Thor, which, I was looking forward to. I thought it was a pretty cool idea. They had Sam Wilson as Captain America, which I thought was kind of lame, but it was like, whatever. Let's see the direction they go. They brought back Old Man Logan because they ended up killing Wolverine, which I was kind of happy with. And they ended up bringing Old Man Logan in, which I was excited about. And I thought what they did at the beginning, I can't remember the name of the guy who was writing them, Lemire, something, I don't know. But I liked it. I liked what he was doing. And then, I don't know what happened to him. He wasn't on the book anymore, and I started to not really be a big fan of those stories. And the escape that, Marvel Comics had provided for so many years, it just wasn't there anymore. It was getting, and I didn't realize this before, but it was getting really political. And there's always been politics in comics, but, I think, at least with Marvel, they did a pretty good job of balancing, the different sides and having different voices and different takes on it. And I thought it was interesting, but it didn't really delve too deeply into that kind of stuff. It didn't get over political. It didn't get politicized. it was still an escape. They would take inspiration from the outside world, but in the end, this was like a different universe. So they didn't have to follow those same rules and really go by everything that was happening here. They could still address things, but they did it in a way that made the stories entertaining, and I loved it. Comic books, in a lot of ways, were sort of part of the development of my morality in a way. There's a lot of other stuff too, but I mean, that was part of it. So I just sort of fell away from it. I wasn't interested in the stories. I didn't bother. And then I came across this channel, which I'm sure some of you have heard if you're, because I'm going to tag them, Diversity&Comics. And I started listening to a lot of his criticisms of the current state of what he calls SJW Marvel. And he mentioned other comic companies and whatnot. So you go into it. He was expressing what he felt. He roasted a few creators, a few pros. But I think he did a really good job of breaking down what was bugging me about it. Now, he's been pretty vilified, and I've seen things on Twitter, and I've seen other videos where, they try to call him, a bigot and alt-right and misogynistic and all this kind of stuff. And it's, if you really listen to his videos, he doesn't come across that way, at least not to me. His big issue, and I think I have to agree, is that he's tired of the surface traits being put front and center of these comics. And it's interesting because I see it in some of the TV shows I used to watch that I don't bother with anymore, because they're trying to make it seem like we've never had diversity before. That diversity is something that's new, that's something that is edgy and it's controversial, and it really isn't. We've had diversity for a very long time. And I'm talking about things like, prominent minority characters, people who are black, people who are Asian, people who are female, people they say are marginalized today. But, growing up, these characters were front and center. And the evidence is there, but a lot of people don't want to think about that. But this is the thing, is they were written as people. The color of their skin, their gender or sexual orientation wasn't necessarily a big deal. Sexual orientation was a bit more of a big deal. That took a while before it became something that was more accepting. But even in comics, they had characters that were gay, but that wasn't the defining characteristic. It was just something that they were. And maybe that did influence how the character developed in some ways, but it wasn't something that was that overwhelmingly important. I mean, it was important, but the character development was, I think, a lot better. It was a lot tighter, and I like those stories. You look at a character like Rhodey, James Rhodes, who was War Machine, who filled in as Iron Man a few times, and people accepted this character because you had this character development. You had this character built up in a way over time that people fell in love with. And a lot of the characters, the so-called diverse characters recently, have just been sort of thrown in, and you're told you have to like these characters. And if you don't like these characters, then all of a sudden you're a bigot, and you don't like them because they're black, or because they're gay, or because they're a woman, and because they're Asian, or whatever the issue they wanted to say. And looking at it, and I realized that no, you just don't like the character because you're trying to force this character on me, and I haven't had time to grow to like this character. A character like Wolverine, he appealed to me because he was this badass character who, could heal, and he pushed himself, and he was rough and didn't take any crap from anybody. And as a kid growing up, a kid who was bullied a lot growing up, it resonated. It's like, I wish I could be that tough. I wish I could be that resilient. I wish things didn't hurt me as much. But as I grew up and I saw different writers tackle the character, you saw a lot more layers. You started to see how, the character of Wolverine, the character of Logan, was a very complex character. You got an idea of the fact that he was very old and he had been through a lot and he'd seen a lot, and it affected him. And he realized that, while his body could heal quickly, he suffered from a lot of trauma. And it's something that, I could identify with in my life. But it took years to really, grow and understand and care about that character. And then it became, they ended up working and pushing him to have, this, his healing ability was so much more powerful, and it's like he couldn't get hurt. And I had some issues with the way he was being written. So when they killed him off, I was kind of happy with it. And Old Man Logan was a way to kind of go back to the roots of that character. But I don't think they did a pretty good job with that, because it seems like they didn't care. And, when this guy Diversity in Comics was talking about the writers on these characters saying, and his take was that these people didn't care about these characters. You could see that, you could feel that, at least I did. And it pushed me away from actually wanting to see what happened with them. I just didn't care anymore. And I went on to other things. But then I realized, this was, a huge part of me growing up, and I kind of want to see these characters do well. Now, he's done some videos where he's pointed out the sales, and I don't know as much about the comic book industry as he does. He gives quite a bit of insight, and it seems like he knows what he's talking about. But my take on it is, right now, you've got such a boom of superhero-themed movies in Hollywood. Really successful. Like even the DC ones that don't do as well as Marvel, they still do pretty good. But the Marvel ones, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it should be pushing people towards the comics. Like, people going to see these movies, should be inspired to go and say, oh, I want to learn more about these characters and their origins. And I mean, I think the comics should be doing a hell of a lot better. But when you have people who just don't seem to care about the characters, or at the very least, even if they do care, but they're not telling stories that people want to read, that becomes a problem. I think Marvel should be doing a hell of a lot better with their comics right now, and I think Marvel, at least the people at the very top, understand that, and they've made some changes. And they're listening to this guy, and they're listening to Captain Cummings, and they're listening to Doug Ernst. They're listening to a lot of these other people who actually care about it. And the critics of folks, the critics of Diversity in Comics, people who have an issue with him and what he's saying, I don't see them breaking his argument. All I see is them constantly saying that, he's putting, people down because of whatever their surface traits are, whether they're, a visible minority who they call marginalized or whatever, but it's not. I think his issue is that people were hired based on these traits to create characters that go along with whatever these traits are. And I mean, I think that's bigoted. I think that, if you're hiring a black person to write a black person, it all depends on what the story is. If you're hiring somebody who's transgender to write a transgender character, okay, I mean, on the surface, that seems like, okay, they'll have some insight. But then when you look at the stories, and the stories are just not good, and the characters are not relatable, and you don't care about the characters, and then you start putting people down for not liking the characters, it's I don't know, it's excuses. It's actually, I don't want to call them excuses, because an excuse would excuse people from that. It's reasons that people are not buying, and people are not buying the comic. That's the thing, comics are a business when it comes down to it. I mean, I understand being an artist, whether you're a writer or you draw, or whatever your talents are, that you're putting your heart and soul into it, and I can respect that. But if people don't want to buy it, you have to understand that there are industries built around the comic book industry. Marvel Comics, there's more to it than just people who are in the industry making money directly making these books. There are economies, and from what I've heard, a lot of comic shops are shutting down because they're just not making the money. And like my comic shop has had to diversify its retail store just to keep going. Comics, my comic shop, comic books are like in a back corner, and there's trade paperbacks, but they're selling everything else. They've had to change their business model just to survive, and I really hope they do well, but I feel bad for the ones who are not doing well. But it's frustrating, and I'm hoping that changes are made and that people try to court my business, because I don't mind giving money to people who write stories that I want to read. If you write stories that I don't want to read, I'm not going to pay the money for it. And I think a lot of the pros that have had issues with diversity in comics and have had issues with fans who have criticized them. You can keep criticizing your fans and criticizing your customers, but if people aren't going to pay the money for your books, then you're going to be out of a job. And it's easy for people who have been in the business for a very long time, who are established, to make the argument to keep their jobs. But people wanting to break in, the newer people, they're either going to get out of it or they're going to go somewhere else. I've seen a lot of people have gone to DC, a lot of people have gone to Image, and even they're having their problems. So I don't know. I wish people would just sort of take the criticism, stop calling names, because the names aren't helping. If you want to call somebody a bigot, you can, but that argument, I keep seeing it being broken. And I also get it. People don't like criticism. I don't like when people criticize me. It pisses me off. But I have to, if you've got a lot of people saying the same thing, then you have to kind of take a moment and start being a bit more self-reflective, I think. Because I want to love comics, and I think comics should be doing much better with all these movies, these hit movies. My God, you've got Black Panther coming out, you've got Avengers Infinity War coming out, you've got Deadpool 2 coming out, you've got, Han Solo, because you've got Star Wars comics with Marvel now, Han Solo's coming out, you've got Ant-Man and the Wasp coming out, you've got all of these movies coming out that Marvel Comics could very easily utilize that publicity with those movies and get a whole bunch of new fans. And if you don't want customers buying your books, that's fine. Then maybe you should, leave a big publisher, go out and create your own characters, start your own imprint, and try it there and prove people wrong. Maybe these characters aren't best for Marvel. So try it on your own, put out the books on your own, and see if people buy it. But just saying that, because people are racist or sexist, that's not why they're buying it. Look, X-Men has been, X-Men was my team. X-Men was my comic. Loved the X-Men, not just for Wolverine, but I loved Storm, I loved Cyclops, I loved Sunfire, I loved all these characters. And it was interesting because you had these characters who were incredibly diverse, not just with their powers, but how they were affected by the world. And you had some amazing writers who drew me in with their stories and got me interested. And as I got older, I kind of got away from it a bit because when it became an artist's medium, when some of the stories were getting a little bit too kiddie for me, too childish for me. I'll say childish, but I wasn't getting drawn in by the story as much. The art was fantastic. I love the art. But then they started bringing in, writers who were different, who started telling more adult type stories. And that's what brought me back to comics, was the story. The story was doing well. The art was also doing pretty good. But, the stories were what kept me coming in. And I started checking out more independent stuff or stuff that was away from Marvel and DC. One of the series that I loved was Planetary by Warren Ellis. And I think it was Wildstorm. I think now Planetary is part of the DC universe, but it wasn't really part of the DC continuity. They hinted at it a little bit, but it was such a different story. And I mean, those are the comics I was starting to like. They weren't the regular superhero comics, but the writing, to me, was incredible. They were telling these incredible stories. And that's the thing. If you don't have the writing, if you don't have the passion for the writing, and I don't know the people who, the people who are being criticized, I don't know them. I don't know exactly what their intentions are, or, they if they believe that they're doing a great job, then, I don't want to put them down for that. They're just stories that I'm not interested in. And, you could say, well, it's too bad for you, but it seems like I'm not the only one. It seems like people who are in the majority are the ones who don't want to read these stories. But anyway, with the X-Men, sorry, I got off on a tangent a bit there. But with the X-Men, you had diverse characters. You had true diversity, but, the characters were mutants, but it wasn't, and it was defining feature of who these characters were, but each one had their own separate personality. And they were heroes. They sacrificed themselves. They put themselves in danger in order to save a world that hated and feared them. And that was, like, their motivation was, I don't know, it was different. Each character had their own different motivations, but in the end, they put themselves out there to make a difference. And it was inspiring. A lot of these characters now, they don't. They're selfish, or they're egotistical, or they're narcissistic. I can't find myself looking up to these characters. And I don't care what they look like in that sense. I don't care if they're female. I don't care if they're black. I don't care if they're gay. There's characters that you can look up to that you love because of the character, because of the personality, because of their actions, because of what they do or what they don't do. Those surface traits, in the end, you don't care about them. And for the longest time, I didn't care about them. I liked a lot of these characters. I didn't care what color they were. I didn't care if they were attracted to somebody of the same sex. And none of that mattered. It was a part of who they were, but it wasn't something that took me away from that character. If this was a character who was a hero, it's a character I could look up to. If they did the right thing, even though it made their life difficult, I could look up to that. And that's the kind of characters that we want. So yeah, that's that's kind of my 2 cents on it. There's a lot more I could say, rant and rave about it, but I want better comics. I want better stories. I want to have a reason to spend money on comics again. I'll still get The Walking Dead because I'm liking the story. I think they're doing a good job with the characters. There's some arcs that don't always go well, but for the most part, I'm loving it. TV series, I think they need to up their game, The Walking Dead, but the comic, I think, is doing a really great job. And for how long it's been around, keeping me interested, I'm happy with that. And they have a lot of great characters that, sure, they might have something about them, like the one character, Jesus. He's one of my favorite characters. I think he's awesome. And he's gay. And I don't care that he's gay. It's just another level of the character that he is. And it's not, being gay isn't like his most defining quality. It's the character that he is and what he does and the sacrifices he makes. And the fact that he's like badass martial artist. And it's awesome. My favorite character, I think, of The Walking Dead is Michonne. Only because I'm a big fan of swords and katanas. But I mean, I look at this character and I look up to her. And, oh my god, the latest issue, no spoiler, I'm not going to spoil it for you. But the latest issue that I got of The Walking Dead had, like, a game-changing moment for Michonne, and I cannot wait to see what happens with this story. And that's what we want. We want to have characters that we care about. We want to have characters that we root for. We want to have characters that we look up to. We want to have characters who do have flaws. But then when they have flaws, we can relate to them because we have flaws. Regular people have flaws. But you've got these characters who are able to overcome their flaws and do the right thing. Or maybe try to do the right thing and still fail. I don't know, it's just you have so many different layers, and that's good writing. And a lot of folks at Marvel right now, they just don't seem to get that. Maybe they have a story in their head that they're trying to tell, but they're just unable to create that narrative. And if that's the case, then keep working at it, but don't get pissed off at people for not liking what you do. And I mean, if people want to criticize you, try to take it. I mean, there's people who take that criticism, they think, okay, how can I be better? And I think that's a good lesson for all of us. Not just when it comes to comic books, but for me, I try to, I struggle. I have a hard time getting things done. And I see that. And I try to learn from my mistakes. Better to learn from other people's mistakes, but I try to learn from my mistakes and do a better job next time. I try to set that example for the people around me. But anyway, I am about halfway home. I don't want these videos to go too long, so I'm going to stop it here. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. Hit the bell for notifications so that you know when my next videos come up. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. I look forward to reading your comments. If you like this, if you don't like it, let me know. I want to make better videos. I want to get better at this, so I will take your criticisms to heart. Thank you very much for watching, and have a wonderful night. Peace.